In 1965, a family would move into a 19-room mansion known as Breeze Knolls in Westfield, New Jersey. That family would be the List family. John List, his wife Helen List, their 3 children, Patricia, 16, John Jr., 15, and 13-year-old Frederick. And John's elderly mother, Alma List, would also live with the family at the time. The family actually had lived in Breeze Knolls for a few years after 1965. And from the outside view, people thought John List was living the American dream. He had a family, he had a big house, he had a good job. But what they didn't know is that tragedy was going to soon strike that family. John was born on September 17th, 1925 in Bay City, Michigan. And List was the only child to John Sr. List and Alma List. List grew up to be a Lutheran and a Sunday school teacher just like his father. And he would graduate high school in 1943 and soon would serve as a laboratory technician in the military. And after he was discharged in 1946, he enrolled at the University of Michigan and earned a bachelor's degree in business admin and a master's degree in accounting. But in 1950, John was recalled back to the military to serve in the Korean War, and in 1951, he would meet a widow named Helen Taylor and her young daughter Brenda. John and Helen would get married on December 1st, 1951 in Baltimore, Maryland. And in 1952, the family would start growing more. And the family would start moving several times due to John losing his job. But in 1965, they would finally move into Breeze Knolls because John would get a job as vice president and comptroller at the bank in Jersey City. But in 1971, John would get fired from his job, and out of shame and embarrassment, he would not tell his family about this. Instead, he would get up in the morning in his suit and tie and pretended to go off to work. In reality, John would go to the train station to read the newspaper and steal money from his mother's joint bank account to pay the mortgage. John would refuse to go on welfare and saw poverty as a sin. And in the end, John thought there was only one way out: to kill his whole family. On the morning of November 9th, 1971, John would get up and dressed and went downstairs to have breakfast with his children. And as soon as the children left for school, John would go into his car and grab 2 handguns. John's wife Helen was already going downstairs to have her morning cup of coffee, and List snuck up behind her and shot her in the back of the head at the kitchen table. After John murdered his wife, he would go up 2 flights of stairs to his mother's upstairs apartment. Alma would greet her son with a kiss on the cheek and ask, "What was that noise?" John didn't answer her, but instead he raised his handgun at her and shot her underneath her left eye. After that, he would go back downstairs to the kitchen to drag his wife's body into the ballroom and place it onto some sleeping bags. And he would clean the blood off the kitchen floor so the children wouldn't notice anything off when they got back from school. John would go out and close his and his mother's checking accounts, and he would stop milk deliveries, mail deliveries, and newspaper deliveries from the house. And then John would write letters to his children's schools to explain why they wouldn't be attending for the next several weeks, due to them because they would be visiting a sick family member. After John came home from doing his errands, he would make himself some lunch and sat down at the same table he shot his wife at hours ago and ate a sandwich and waited for his children to come home. I mean, I don't know how anybody would just sit down and eat a sandwich after murdering their wife and mother. Just don't understand how. John's 16-year-old daughter, Patty, was the first one to arrive home. As she walked into the kitchen, List snuck up behind her and shot her in the jaw. And he would drag her body into the ballroom and lay her body on some sleeping bags near her mother. John's youngest son, Freddie, was the second one to arrive home. As soon as the child entered the house, he got the same treatment as his sister. Instead of waiting for his oldest son, John Jr., to come home, John would drive to Westfield High School to watch his son play in a soccer game. As soon as the soccer game was over, John drove his son home, and when the father-son duo entered the house and then into the kitchen, John Jr. set his gym bag on the kitchen counter, and once John Jr.'s back was turned, John took out his gun and shot his son in the head. But this murder would be different. John Jr. wouldn't go down easy. John Jr.'s body started to twitch, and in result, John would shoot his son 10 more times. After killing John Jr., John felt like his assignment for the day was done. He dragged John Jr.'s body into the ballroom and laid his body on some sleeping bags next to his brother. John would clean up the murder scene, and then after he would go into the ballroom and say some prayers for his family. And then he would write a 5-page letter to his pastor. I'm not going to be reading the confession letter in this video, but if you guys do want to read it yourself, it's really easy to find on the internet. And when you do read this letter, it gives a really big conclusion about why John did this. So if you guys are interested in reading that, just look up John List's confession letter and you should be able to find it. By the time it was already 6 p.m. and it was already dark, John went to the kitchen to eat dinner after murdering his whole family. After he was done eating, he cleaned up and fed the children's pet goldfish, and then he went upstairs to bed. When the next day rolled around, John went downstairs, turned the thermostat down to below freezing, placed some religious music on the intercom in the ballroom, and turned every light in the house on and left the house for good. John would drive down to the Kennedy Airport in New York City to abandon his car and then get on a bus and leave Westfield for good. The bodies wouldn't be discovered until a month later. Patty's high school drama teacher, Mr. Ed Ilianos, would start to worry about Patty because she hasn't been heard of in a month. And there was a school play that she was in that was coming up soon, and she would have told Ed if she couldn't do the show. Mr. Ilianos goes out to the List family house, and neighbors would see the man walking around the property, and they would call the police. When 2 Westfield police officers arrived at the house, they would find Mr. Ilianos. They would ask Mr. Ilianos, "What are you doing here?" Mr. Ilianos would explain that he's not an intruder, and that he knew the family, and that he knew Patty List, and he just wanted to know where the List family was. The 2 officers would enter the house through an unlocked window, and the house smelt like death, and they knew that something was wrong. The 2 officers would walk through the house, and once they got to the ballroom, they found the bodies of Helen List and her 3 children. Once the bodies were discovered, in the ballroom, they would discover a 5th body. They would discover Alma List's body and the 5-page letter that John wrote to his pastor. The police knew that John List was responsible for the murder of his family. A nationwide manhunt was launched for John List, but the letter John left in the house was dated on November 9th, 1971, so John had a 1-month head start, and it would take 18 years until John was finally caught. So when John List got on that bus, he headed to Denver, Colorado, where he got a new social security number and went by the name Robert Peter Clark. John would get a job as a fry cook at a hotel diner. He would make friends with his neighbor, Wanda Flannery. As the case started to die down, John would slowly go back into his life as the years went by. He went to church. He got a job as an accountant. He would even remarry to Wanda's friend, Dolores Miller, in 1985. The couple would move to Virginia in 1988. In 1989, Westfield police would go to America's Most Wanted to get an episode aired about John List. They would have forensic artist Frank Mander make a sculpture of John List and what he would look like to almost 20 years after he murdered his family. On the day the episode was aired, John List's former neighbor, Wanda Flannery, would see the episode, and once she saw this sculpture of John List, she knew right from there that that was Robert Peter Clark. Wanda Flannery would call into the show and give the tip about Robert Peter Clark and everything that she knew about the man. FBI agents soon go down to Robert Peter Clark's house to find that the man wasn't home, and at the time his wife was there alone. Soon they would find Robert Peter Clark at his accounting job and arrest him. Once Robert Peter Clark was arrested, they gathered fingerprint evidence from the man, and a DNA evidence matched from John List's fingerprints would prove that Robert Peter Clark was, in fact, John List. John List would finally go back to Westfield to face justice for the murder of his family. At John List's court hearing, John was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and John would die in 2008. Okay, I'm going to be adding some eerie facts that I think is interesting to this case. So let's go back to 1951 when John and Helen first met. So after John and Helen first met, they soon started dating, and the couple would go on to date for 2 months, and then they would get married in Baltimore. And the only reason why they got married after a short period of time is because Helen lied to John, saying that she was pregnant. In reality, she wasn't. And after the couple got married, John would figure out that she wasn't pregnant, and he would feel like he got tricked into a marriage. And also, Helen was keeping another secret from John. Helen did in fact have syphilis, and John had no idea about it until much, much later on down the road. Also, on the day of the murders, Helen's mother was actually supposed to go visit the family, but at the time she fell gravely ill, and she had to cancel the visit with her family, and she hadn't gotten sick on that very day, she would have ended up being John's sixth victim. When it was almost over a year after the murders happened, the mansion known as Briggs Knolls would mysteriously burn down from a random arson attack. And after the mansion burned down, like the glass ceiling in the ballroom would turn out to be a Tiffany skyline and it was worth over $100,000. And at the time, that would have covered John List's financial struggles until he could have found a new job. And honestly, in my opinion, I think John had much more problems than just his financial problems. Also, let's go back to Mr. Ilianos. So after the murders happened, Mr. Ilianos would go on to make a movie called The Patricia List Story. And when I first saw this, I thought this was going to be like a point of view of what he saw before the murders actually happened. But in reality, it was a movie about him reenacting his sexual fantasies with his dead 16-year-old student. I just don't understand people anymore. But whenever I researched about Mr. Ilianos and Patricia, there was a lot of facts saying that Mr. Ilianos had some sort of weird fascination with Patty. And there was even some rumors that there was something more going on between Mr. Ilianos and Patty. But I couldn't find any information to back this up, so those are just left as rumors. So that brings the end to this video, and overall, in my opinion, John had other options. Whatever problems that he was going through, the financial problems, his belief that his family is turning away from Christianity, and he wanted them to be Christians and for them to believe in God to get the afterlife that they deserved. But at the end of it, John chose the worst option possible by murdering 5 members in his family who done nothing. And John did this because he was incredibly selfish. People say that John only did this because of his financial problems. And in my opinion, John had more problems than that. That he saw that taking care of his family was becoming a big burden. There was no more money left to support that house. house. So he thought if I get rid of my family, I can start over and make a new life. He could have took different options. He could have left his family there. He could have divorced Helen and just left. Or he could have taken the kids to go live somewhere else with his mother. There. At the end of it, John had other options. He just chose the worst one. And now he suffered the consequences from that. But at the end of it, he just took 5 innocent lives. Because he was a religious nut job.